Hello, my name is Anthony Brandt. We're here for another session of the series at LTV that we call Conversations. My guest today is Robert A. Caro, the author of his most recent book, Working, and of a biography of Robert Moses, and one of the most magnificent efforts of our time in biography, a now 5-volume, or soon-to-be 5-volume, biography of Lyndon Johnson. Welcome, Bob. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be talking to you, Tony.
Well, there we go.
An old friend.
Yes. I think I want to point this interview towards power, because you've been thinking about and writing about power for such a long time. In everything you've written, you've been thinking about power and how people get it, and how they keep it, and how they act with it.
Yeah.
And of course, in Robert Moses's case, he kind of ran parts of New York City for years and years, and he was not an elected official.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, how did that happen? How did he get that power? Where did it come from?
Yeah. But that's why I started to do that book in the first place. I said, you know, we live in a democracy where power comes from our votes supposedly at the ballot box. But Robert Moses was never elected to anything, and he had more power than anyone who was elected, more power than any mayor, more power than any governor, more power than any mayor and governor put together. And he held this power for 44 years, almost half a century. And with it, he completely shaped the landscape we live in.
Right.
You know, with one exception, the FDR Drive, if you drive on a road that has the word expressway or parkway in it, 627 miles of them in total, Robert Moses built every mile. And he built all the bridges that we travel on, and he shaped or reshaped every park, and he created great things like Jones Beach. And at the same time, when he was ramming his expressways through New York City, he destroyed, I think I identified, I was going to look this up before I talk to you, I think it's 21 neighborhoods.
21 neighborhoods.
Yeah, 21 separate.
Well, you're very vivid on the subject of East Trent in the Bronx.
Yes.
Where he pushed through the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Yes.
And he drove thousands of people out of their homes.
Oh, in that neighborhood, he actually evicted 15,000, but of course he destroyed the neighborhood. So everyone moved away. So it was really like a town of 50. It was a community.
Yeah.
New York said it used to have real communities, neighborhoods where everybody knew you, you know. And that was a community of 50 or 60,000 people. The majority were Jews, but there were an awful lot of Irish, Germans, and blacks, because the neighborhoods were so stable that black Americans could move into them without people getting all upset about it. The neighborhood absorbed them. And now that is all gone. It's a vast slum. And the people who were driven away, all dead now. They lived the rest of their lives. You know, I used to interview them. And over again, when I was interviewing them, wherever they had been driven to, housing projects or Co-op City, or to live with their kids in Westchester, or the word I kept hearing was lonely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why could nobody stop this?
Well, he was, going back to your first question, he was sort of a genius in amassing power. You didn't have to spend much time with him to know to be sort of afraid of him. He was arrogant and just absolutely ruthless in doing. So he thought he was going to be elected to something. You know, he built Jones Beach and all. He was the most popular figure in New York State, and he ran for governor in 1934.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Before you and I were born, so.
Yes. Not that long before.
That's true.
But people got a look at him. And when they got a look at him, they were really turned off. And he went into that campaign, as I say, very popular. He came out of it, he lost the governorship to Herbert Lehman by what is still to this day, Tony, the largest majority anyone ever lost a statewide election for anything in the history of New York State. So he knew he was never going to get power through being elected, but he had this great, had a great mind. He conceived of public authorities as the way he could get power. And he wrote that up to that time, public authorities had been entities that built, they floated bonds to build a bridge, Henry Hudson Bridge or something. They collected tolls on the bridge until the bond was paid off, and then they went out of business. Moses wrote legislation which ostensibly was just combining public authorities. But actually, buried in this legislation, I wrote a chapter called The Best Bill Drafter in Albany. In this bill were things that nobody understood. Mayor LaGuardia didn't understand that he endorsed it. The legislature didn't understand what they were passing. But it basically said, these public authorities never have to go out of business. They can always roll over the bonds for another 40 years. And Robert Moses is always going to be in charge of them. And he later, there were many other sources of power, but that was the real basis of it.
Did anybody ever challenge it?
Well, many people tried to challenge it. You couldn't basically challenge it because he had done, as I say, we're talking about, for whatever we think of what he did, without judging it, he was a genius in creating power. And what he did, there's a clause in the Constitution of the United States that says that no state shall abrogate the conditions of a contract, meaning if you have a legal contract,
This holds.
It holds.
Yeah.
He sold these bonds with bond covenants, saying that he was the chairman of the authority, and that they could always, what I said, always roll out, and he would always be. And he affixed that, he attached it, he embodied it in the legislation that the legislature passed. So you couldn't,
couldn't get around it.
You couldn't get it around it for 44 years. The one thing, the way he was finally removed, he came to power in 1924. He stayed in power till 1968. He was at the height of his power when the one thing happened that he hadn't figured out would be, if anyone challenged it, his defense was that the bondholders would object. And the trustee for the bondholders was the Chase Manhattan Bank. The one thing Robert Moses hadn't figured on was that the president of the Chase Manhattan Bank would be the brother of the governor, David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller.
Right. So
the bondholders David Rockefeller didn't protect him when Nelson wanted to remove him.
There was as I remember, there was an attempt to drive an expressway through Greenwich Village.
Yes.
And Jane Jacobs fought it.
Yes.
Jane Jacobs, for those who don't know, is one of the great urban thinkers of our time. She's dead now, of course, but she was, I used to own her book, a first edition of it, and I sold it for a lot of money. But I know that she led the fight against that, and she won, obviously.
Yes. Well, this was basically just as he was losing power. Yeah.
Well, it seems like his whole career he was abusing power. He was...
Well, he did, he did great. See, there are two sides to Moses. One is this really ruthless, he used to say things like, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs,
Right.
But the egg might be a neighborhood of 50 or 60,000 people, a community that you
Right.
just ran this
Right.
road through. The other side of him was that he was a real, you could call him a visionary, but on this huge scale, Tony.
Mm-hmm.
In each of his, so during the brief time when I was allowed to interview him, that didn't last very long. But in each of his offices, he had 12 offices because he had 12 different state and city positions at the same time. There was this huge map that covered a whole wall of the office behind him of New York City and Long Island and Westchester
His
and
whole purview.
yeah, and part of New Jersey. When he got excited about something, he'd jump up like a kid, and he had this, you know, they used to have these long yellow pencils with erasers at the end.
Right, I remember.
He'd go, so he always had a couple of aides sitting behind him. So he'd go like this, and an aide would slap a pencil into his hand, and he'd jump up and he'd say, "Can't you?" To me, he'd say, "Can't you see? If we put the highway here, then the parks can be here, and we'll put the housing part." And you suddenly realize that, you know, this pencil would go over the whole map. He was connecting Staten Island and Montauk, you know? And you said, here's a guy who looks at this whole metropolitan area, this vast area, like a painting. And he spent 44 years filling in the painting to his vision. And when he would talk about things, I'm going on, like Jones Beach, how we first dreamed of Jones Beach. You said, this is the most thrilling thing that he's just thrilling when he talks about his vision.
Yeah. Well, at least he had a vision.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people go after power without any sense of a vision at all. They just want the power.
Exactly.
And those are the ones who become truly corrupt.
Yes.
And we've seen plenty of it in our lifetimes. Far too much.
Far too much, yeah.
Is it possible, do you think, to have power that is, in some sense, pure? I've been asking myself that question for a very long time, in the sense that the power is totally benign. There used to be, they used to speak about benign dictators whose idea was that we'll improve the world and I have the power to do that, and so I'm just going to do it. But that's not the way of a democracy. The way of democracy is you have to sell things, you have to compromise, and otherwise you don't get anywhere.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I mean, my own little thing about being the chairman of the ARB in Sag Harbor, I had power. And it was very small, but it had to do with people's lives. And you think, how can I use this power to benefit these people? And I figured out the ways that I wanted to do it.
Right.
But I wonder if people like Moses, do they have a conscience about the things that, the lives that they ruin, the neighborhoods they destroy?
Well, not in Moses' case.
Not in
He
Moses.
saw only the end, you know. He had this expression. He had a lot of great, you know, he was a great
wordsmith. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a wonderful poet when he was at Yale, you know.
Really?
He would say, if the end doesn't justify the means, what does? Well, you say, oh, well, that's right. But then you say,
wait a minute.
Wait a minute. What are the means?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
To Moses, any means, you know, he would destroy people who stood in his way. I mean, he had what he called them his bloodhounds. So they were a team of investigators, private detectives. If a public official opposed him or opposed one of his projects, he would say, in his words, he'd put the bloodhounds on them. They'd go back in great detail over the guy's whole record. What had he done? For example, had he joined a communist you know, a leftist organization when he
Right.
was in college, which everybody did in the 30s. Then they'd leak it in a derogatory way to newspapers, and the guy, over and over again, people with really great records of public service would be destroyed by him, driven out. You know, it was a Rexford Tugwell. It says, Tugwell Pinko, you know, was the
I
headline.
remember that name,
Yeah.
and I don't know in what connection.
Well, he was, Rexford Tugwell was a member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust.
Right.
Then he
Okay.
came back and was involved in the Planning Commission of New York City. The Planning Commission was trying to rein Moses in, and Moses destroyed him. But I mean, we're talking about many, many officials. I remember once, about when I'm talking about the thing you were talking about, running the Cross Bronx Expressway through East Tremont, which was really, Moses could have picked an alternate route, just 2 blocks away. And instead of displacing 15 or 16,000 people, all he had to take down was 5 or 6 small tenements. But he wanted it to go where he wanted it to go, through the center
Right.
of the neighborhood. So a man named Henry Epstein, completely forgotten the history, he was a deputy mayor, and he was convincing Mayor Wagner to try to stop this, to make Moses take the alternate route. So I couldn't understand it. When I was doing the research on this, Epstein was opposing the expressway and opposing it. Then all of a sudden he writes this letter to Wagner saying, Moses's route is the right route. So I asked Moses, why did Mr. Epstein change his mind? For a while, Moses wouldn't answer me, but I kept asking. Finally, he said, changed his mind because we hit him with a meat axe. And it took,
I don't know why I'm laughing, but-
what he said was, what he did, his bloodhounds had found out that Epstein was having an affair. Epstein was married, but was having an affair with somebody. And Moses basically said to him, or had said to him by someone else, I don't know we're going to give this to the tabloids if you don't change your view. So he said, Henry, I remember him sitting there, and Moses had saying, so Henry changed his mind and wrote that letter. So if you stood in his way, he was going to be utterly ruthless in seeing that you got out of his way.
It's hard to imagine being a person like that.
It's hard to imagine the other side also, though, this genius at seeing the whole city.
Yeah, this odd combination. LBJ, I was thinking about that this morning and what you wrote about, well, you went and lived in the hill country in Texas where he was from for 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And you got to know all the people.
Yeah.
And what came out of that, I mean, everybody knows now, thanks to you, that LBJ got that area electrified. And I was curious to know, exactly how did he do that? It's a rural area, people are spread way wide apart. You'll go down the road, as you said, and you'll go for 30 miles before you see a house.
Yes.
And that's a lot of expense for an electric company to put up the wires and the poles and everything else required to electrify a country like that.
Yes.
He must have had some sort of genius of his own that was able to find a way to make this happen.
That is the particular, you just put your finger on it, that's the particular nature of Lyndon Johnson's political genius. That he had compassion for people, whether they were black people for whom he passed the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act, or these poor farmers and ranchers, really poor, and as you say, in isolated homes throughout this vast expanse. You know, the hill country started right at the western edge of the city of Austin, and goes on for 360 miles.
Oh boy.
And when Einar and I used to go through this, the settlers called it the land of endless horizons, because every time you got to the top of one ridge of hills, there were more ridges ahead of you. And they lived lives like peasants out of the Middle Ages, because they had to pull up every bucket of water by hand, do everything by hand. It seemed impossible to bring electricity to them because, just like you said, there was no dam to provide hydroelectric power. And if you got the dam, how did you get? It's tens of thousands of miles of wire that has to go. So Johnson is 28 years old. Nobody knows really who he is. He's running against better known opponents. He hits on this, the women in the hill country are very stooped. I mean, when I started interviewing them, he said, you know, they're much more bent over than city people are. And the reason was they had to carry the water and everything, do manual, all the stuff that we do by pressing a button or turning a faucet, they had to do by hand. He hits on this line. He says, if you elect me, you won't look like your mothers look. And he gets elected. And he goes to Roosevelt. He had attracted Roosevelt's attention. Roosevelt had this gift. If he didn't want to give you something, he knew what you were there to ask for. If he didn't want to give it to you, he would talk the whole time in his charming way, and then he'd say, well, I guess that's all we have time for, and then he'd have to go. That's what he did to the young Lyndon Johnson first. Johnson goes to one of Roosevelt's aides, who is a friend of his, and says, you gotta get me another appointment. This time he goes in with a picture of the dam that he wants and shows it to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt calls this assistant and says, oh, give the kid the goddamn dam, okay? So now he's got the dam. But the rural electrification...
Excuse me, was this on the Pecos River?
No, it was on the lower Colorado River.
Oh, okay.
And, I mean, but building the dam was a whole...
Yeah, that's a big project.
A whole other story.
Right.
But let's say the dam gets built. Who's going to lay these lines? No private company could possibly do it. The Rural Electrification Administration had refused to do it because it was too many farms, too scattered. And Roosevelt Johnson persuades Roosevelt to order the Rural Electrification Administration to waive all their requirements and do it anyway. It's quite a thrilling story because these people on these ranches, you could see the line laying crews. You know, it's all limestone, so it was very hard. They had to drive holes to put the poles in, you know, but they could see the crews coming towards them for days and days across the hills. Yeah. And as they got close to the houses, this meant so much to the people that the wives would lay out on their picnic tables fancy lunches, you know, for the linemen when they got to the house. And when they got electricity, it transformed their lives in an instant.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Well, it's a very moving story. And it says something about Johnson, that he's such a complicated person, because there's also, in your first volume, the story of Coke Stevenson.
Yes.
And the fact that that election was probably stolen. I don't know if they ever...
No, it was stolen.
It was stolen.
Yeah.
And that's another way of using power to get what you want, obviously. It's illegal. It's wrong. It's an abuse of power.
Yeah.
And you have to, and I know that when you wrote that book, that first book, you were under so much criticism for bringing this out, number one, and number two, seeming to just present it as opposed to hating Johnson or something like that.
Yeah.
And I know you endured a certain amount of abuse yourself for that.
Oh, people, you know, the Johnson people were very good at attacking me,
Uh-huh.
you know. But as it happens, none of the attacks worked because I had found the person, the judge, the election judge, who actually did the stealing. And he told me exactly how it was done. So basically, with all their attacks, at the end now everybody understands that it was stolen. You know,
Yeah.
he got 6 days after the election, he had stolen tens of thousands of votes to come close to this to Coke Stevenson, his opponent. He had stolen tens of thousands of votes, but 6 days after the election, he was still 100 and some votes behind. And 6 days after the election, they find a ballot box 13, in the desert, right?
In the desert.
And when they open it, there are 202 votes. The interesting thing, 202 votes, 200 are for him, 2 are for Coke Stevenson. The interesting thing about the 202 votes is they're all in the same handwriting. They'd use written ballots. And they're cast in alphabetical order. So I finally, people had said for years, for decades, you know, the Johnson people had said, he didn't steal it. It was just regular Texas politics. But that wasn't true. He had gone further than anyone had ever gone before to steal an election in Texas. And it was the most blatant and outrageous stealing. I was able to find the man, Louis Salas, who actually put those votes, supervised. He didn't want to do it himself. He said, I didn't want my handwriting in there, so he had a deputy do it. But who supervised the casting of those 200 votes.
Wow. Well, it's part of the process of turning over every page, which you've also written about.
Well,
that's a great story, by the way.
Thank you.
You go, you're a reporter, you do some investigative work. Your editor, who is an old grizzled editor from the old days, he looks at you and he says, I didn't think a Princeton guy could do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you did it. And then he gave you this wonderful advice, which is turn over every page.
Yeah.
Now, when you're facing the LBJ library, and it's 45 or 50 million pages, that's a little daunting. And it's one reason, obviously, that your books take so long, because you may not turn over every page, but you find the relevant pages and you turn them over. I mean, I have some experience with that. I did a book, as you know, about a guy who had a wall of boxes and filing cabinets about this size from there to there, and I had to go through every page to find out. But the beauty of it is that it's a great pleasure to do this.
That's what it is.
I mean, it's wonderful to piece together a story. And just find the germs of it in one piece of paper and follow it through. That must have been a wonderful time in your life.
I happen to love going through papers, you know. I just happen to love it.
No, I think it's part of being a writer. If you're our kind of writer, is you're thinking to yourself, what is the story here?
Yes.
And you know it's buried in there.
Yes.
And then you begin to find it, and it's a revelation.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's stuff you didn't know.
And you didn't even have a clue about.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can you remember any experiences, particularly where that happened, where you came upon something that was going on? And
yeah. Well, I'll pick one that relates to what I just talked about, the building of the dam. Mm-hmm. So the story of the building of the dam is basically that he gets contracts for this Texas contracting firm called Brown and Root,
right,
which and makes them a fortune. And but I couldn't figure out, didn't know, did they ever do anything for him in return? They later became one of the huge oil drilling and contracting firms on the face of the earth. And there was a time in Johnson's career where he doesn't have any. Well, how can I tell the story short? That's why my books are so long.
Take your time.
I'm gonna. So Lyndon Johnson is elected to Congress on promise of electricity in 1937. So he's just a junior congressman, has no power at all. All of a sudden, you see by his letters, I'm going through the Johnson Library, there's a real change in tone, and it happens in a specific month, October 1940, just before the election day, November 5th, 1940. Before that time, in his files, all the letters are from him to senior congressmen, committee chairman, and he's basically, the tone is, a junior to a senior, can you give me a few minutes of your time? After that, suddenly the letters are coming the other way. They're a senior congressman asking Lyndon Johnson, can I get a few minutes of your time? What happened in that month? So I was talking to a friend of his, an old Washington fixer named Tommy Corcoran, I asked him that question. He used to call me kid. And I said, what happened in October 1940? However I put it, he said, I'll tell you what happened, kid. He called me kid. Money, kid, money. He said, but you're never going to be able to write about that, kid. I said, why not? He said, because you're never going to find anything in writing. Lyndon Johnson never put anything in writing. That's what he said. But I was going to look through, I couldn't, as you say, you couldn't look through even a small percentage of the papers, but here's something I'm going to look through. I'm going to look through his papers from 1940. And I'm sitting there turning pages, what you're basically sitting there, you're finding nothing, Someone's told you he never puts anything in writing, So you're sitting there and saying, to yourself, schmuck, you're wasting another month of your life here, Then all of a sudden, there it is. It's a telegram from George Brown, one of the heads of Brown and Root, to Lyndon Johnson. The date is October 19th, 1940. I can still see it. It's a Western Union. They used to have yellow telegraph forms, but it was brown now with H,
Right.
And it says, Lyndon, the checks are on the way. And it names the 6 people who are sending him checks. And it says something like, don't tell these names, I can't remember the wording. Underneath it, Lyndon Johnson has in fact written his reply. It says, basically, don't worry, I'm not mentioning their names to anybody, but thank you. So you say, there are the 6 names. So then you could go to cross-reference the files by name in his congressional office, and there is acknowledgement that they each send him $30,000. So that's 6 times, $50,000. So that's 6 times $50,000 is $300,000, which in those days is an immense sum
that's
in
huge.
Political terms. So then you said, okay, so that's how he gets money. What does he do with it? And I keep turning letters, and in another box, I think that was box 6 of his House papers, and I think it's box 7, but it would say in my notes, which suddenly there is the most amazing document. It's, I think, 6 typewritten pages. He had 2 top aides, John Connolly, who later became the governor and Treasury Secretary, and Walter Jenkins. They each told me they typed it. Whichever one typed it. There are 2 typed columns. In the left column is the name of the congressman who had asked Lyndon Johnson for money. In the center column is why he needed the money. The amounts are so small in today's terms, you laugh. Lyndon, if I can get $1,000 more, I can hire the poll watchers. Lyndon, I need a round of last-minute advertising. $450 will do it. But over in the left-hand margin, in Lyndon Johnson's handwriting, is what he decided to do with each request. So if he was giving the guy as much money as he wanted, he'd write, okay. If he was giving him part of the money that he wanted, he'd write, okay, 500 or okay, 300. But if he wasn't going to give him any money, he'd write none. And if he would then, but sometimes he wrote none out. So I asked John Connolly, what did none out mean? And Connolly said to me, that meant he was never getting any money from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson never forgot, and he never forgave. And you say, so that's his first toehold on national power. Suddenly all the congressmen realize there's all this money in Texas. There's only one access to it. It's this young congressman, Lyndon Johnson. So whenever someone asks me why my books take so long, you say, well, you have to turn every page.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's an astonishing story. It's in here.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was amazed by it. But I also wanted to ask, because you say Johnson never wrote anything down, I'm wondering, he had dossiers, I think, on, or so it seems, because he knew so much, about virtually every senator in the Senate. You got that feeling, and that's how he was able to do something like the Voting Rights Act, because he knew what they wanted, and he knew what they'd done, and he had them. He had them by the cojones. And I wondered, did he do that all in his mind, or was it something that he put down in paper that you found?
I don't, he didn't put anything down on what you're talking about on paper, but there would often be letters from congressmen, later, you know, and senators. We're talking more, you know, asking for something, or thanking Johnson for something he did. And I realized all these, it seems like all this stuff had been saved. I mean, as you say, there are 45, or they say 45 million separate pieces of paper in the Johnson Library. So I asked Walter Jenkins, you know, I said something like, I don't remember what I really said. Jenkins said something like, he saved everything. And right answering your question, that was a very good question. And Jenkins said, yes, he saved everything. When there was no room in the office, he'd have us store it, but he would say, store it where I can get my hands on it when I need it. So I said, well, why did he do that? You know what Jenkins said to me? To remind them. In other words, if years later he needed their vote, he had the proof of what he had done for them.
Yes, yes. Wow. Well, he's certainly a mixed bag as a president. I mean, he did fantastic things, and he also did really terrible things. And I know you're dealing with some of that now about Vietnam. And, you know, I always thought that Vietnam was what broke this country in a way.
Well, I'm right.
I know you're not going to talk about it.
I'll give you a pass. I'd ask you to give me a pass on that one.
Right. No, I understand that. Is there anything you'd like to talk about?
No. Well, I think it's very, I'll say, I think it's, you know, I never think of my books as biographies.
Life and Times.
Well, yes, yes, but I never was interested. A biography is the life of someone. I was never in the least interested in just telling the life of a great man. From the moment I first thought of writing a book on Robert Moses, it was to explain how the questions you very perceptively asked here today, how did he do it? Where did he get the power? Because I think we live in a democracy. How did he get the power? How did he use it? How did he abuse it? How did it affect our lives? Like, we're still living completely in the world that Robert Moses created.
Absolutely. Every time you get on the Long Island Expressway,
Every time we get on the Long Island
or
Expressway.
the Southern State, or whatever it is.
Yes. And so I said, I always thought what I wanted to do with that book and then with the Johnson books is show how power works in a democracy. Because if on one sense, it's very important how we cast, how people cast their votes at the ballot box, then the more they know, not about how power works like you're taught in college and in textbooks, but how power really works.
Really works.
The raw, naked realities of power in
Yes.
this country, the better informed our votes will be. And then hopefully, the better our democracy will be.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Well, Jefferson thought that it depended upon education more than anything.
Yes.
And that's why he founded the University of Virginia. I did an edition of his papers
Yes.
from Paris, his writings from Paris. And of course that meant going through 9 volumes of stuff and reading every page. You got to turn over every page, because if you don't, you're going to miss something. And I believe strongly that our education system has basically failed the Republic, because it, long ago, remember we had civics classes, and you found out how a law got passed and it went through the process and all those things. You found out who was in office, you found out how the offices worked, and it was boring, but it was informative. And they did away with those. I can't understand that to this day. Why would they do that?
There's a lot I don't understand about why they don't teach history and civics anymore. Yeah.
No, I love history. Well, I think we're done. So, this has been a conversation with Robert A. Caro, my old friend, and one of the great people of our time. I compare you to Henry Adams, who did 9 volumes on the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. You're only going to do 5, but of course yours a little bit longer than his. But that was a great effort, and this is a great effort. I think it's one of the most magnificent attempts to understand our times that's been made in a long, long time.
Thank you, Tony. Coming from you, that means a lot to me.
Well, all right, folks, we're done.